All right. Thanks for being here. Got on my hat because my hair's gone a little wild, not being able to get a haircut, but hopefully this weekend I can. By the way, if you recognize this symbol, let us know in the chat, and I guess we'll give you a shout out or something there. But anyway, welcome to another Den of Geek UFO live stream. I am the Den of Geek kind of UFO expert, Alejandro Rojas. And we've been bringing you a lot of information about some of the recent news about UFOs that you've seen in the headlines on all of the major networks. What they're so excited about is that the Department of Defense released 3 videos from the Navy that the Navy claims are unidentified. And these are videos that were captured by F-18s. One of the videos is from an incident in 2004. Of course, last week we brought you the radar expert who helped zero in the jet fighters who checked out those objects. And the other 2 are from an incident in 2015 in the Roosevelt aircraft carrier strike group. You can see more about that situation. Well, we can give you a link. The New York Times covered it, but also the television show on the History Channel, Unidentified, covered that as well. And of course, we covered that television show when it was on the first season as well. So you can see those in some Den of Geek articles that I wrote. Anyway, we have been bringing on experts to talk about this, and we brought on another one today that I'm very excited about, and that is a gentleman by the name of Nick Pope. Nick Pope actually investigated UFOs for the Ministry of Defense in the UK. The Ministry of Defense actually investigated UFOs for many, many years until they just shut down their program around a little more than 10 years ago, and we'll talk to Nick about that. So let's bring on Nick, and we'll talk more about all of this recent news. Hello, Nick.
Hi, it's great to be on.
Thanks for coming on and joining us. So the Ministry of Defense actually had a UFO program, and now that I think about it, it's kind of ironic because as that program was wrapping up, in the United States, there was a secretive Pentagon UFO project going on that we didn't even know about. So maybe you can give us kind of a bit of a review on the UK government's involvement in looking into the UFO topic.
Sure thing. Well, the British government's UFO program had more in common with Project Blue Book than with the ATIP program. We were a public-facing project. We received most of our reports from the public, and we treated this simply as a defense and national security issue. If there was anything in our airspace, clearly we needed to know what it was. So the default position when this started back in the days of the Cold War was the question, could any of this be Soviet or Warsaw Pact activity? But as we dived deeper, it became clear that that certainly couldn't explain all of it. And we had a formal UFO program that ran from 1953 through to the end of 2009. And we received several hundred UFO sightings each year. We investigated them, and our mission was to determine whether there was anything that indicated a potential threat to the defense of the United Kingdom, or whether there was anything of more general defense or scientific interest.
Now, in 2009, when they closed down, they essentially kind of adopted the stance that the U.S. has taken, that they just didn't find anything of interest, and so they no longer have any interest. In other words, kind of what you've kind of framed as kind of a surprising attitude, in that if you have a UFO story to share, we're not interested type of attitude.
Yes, I mean, I think the Ministry of Defense's decision to close their program was, I think, understandable but misjudged. And there is a whole wider debate about whether indeed the program continues in some way, shape, or form. And you know, I think I can say with a fairly high degree of confidence that it does, albeit on a more focused basis, looking predominantly at reports from military pilots. But you know, we can come on to that if you'd like. But essentially, yeah, the decision to close it was articulated in the sense of, we've looked at this for over 50 years. In all that time, we haven't found evidence of an overt threat. Well, yes and no. There's been no actual out and out hostility, but there were certainly those of us who took the view that anything in our airspace, in and of itself, that looks like a structured craft, seen and sometimes chased by our pilots, tracked on radar, exactly the sorts of situation that we see in these 3 US Navy videos. That sort of thing, I think some of us took the view this in and of itself was a concern. And yeah, sure, nothing had opened fire on us, but that was a little bit of a cop-out to close the program because of the lack of hostile action.
Mm-hmm. And in that, Luis Alejandro, who ran the Advanced Aerospace Threat Identification Program, ATIP, which was ran out of the Pentagon, were a little bit similar in that, coming to this kind of not knowing much about the topic, but eventually finding that the cases that you ran across were very credible and did demonstrate a mystery.
Absolutely, yes. I've met Lou. We've discussed all this. I mean, clearly there are differences between the British government's project and ATIP, but absolutely, both of us, I think, were somewhat surprised to find ourselves in the position of doing this at all. Neither of us had any interest in the subject beforehand, and the way he was recruited into it sounded pretty similar to what happened to me. They certainly didn't want believers in there, probably didn't want skeptics either. Actually, ideally you want somebody who comes at it with an open mind and a blank sheet of paper and takes a completely data-led approach to it. So most of my career and most of Lou's was spent doing other things that we can probably never really talk about. So we sort of fell into this by accident. But yes, there are similarities and differences too. The main difference, of course, being that ATIP was not a public program. You couldn't pick up the phone and talk to them and report a sighting, whereas British government's project, you could.
Now, getting to kind of the video. So thus far, this is the only sort of AV, as far as video or pictures that Luis has been able to share that was part of their investigation that they felt was credible. Now, you, I believe, haven't been able to, and you can correct me if I'm wrong, share anything like as far as pictures or video, but you do have a story that I think is very intriguing about a photo that you did have in the office that showed something unusual.
Sure, yes. We had, over the years, over the lifetime of the MOD's UFO program, of course, we had a fair deal of photographs and videos sent to us, more obviously in the later years of the project than the former. And we did have, too, some gun camera footage from Royal Air Force jets. Nothing conclusive, nothing you could hang your hat on, but it was there over the years. The Ministry of Defense's official line now is that none of this has survived, by the way, but we had some materials. We had one set of really excellent photographs. These were sent to us by 2 members of the public who had been out hiking in August of 1990 in Scotland. And we had some great pictures that had been analyzed by the Defense Intelligence staff in the Ministry of Defense and also by the Joint Aerial Reconnaissance Intelligence Center. So basically, the UK intelligence community's imagery analysis, resources and capabilities had been brought to bear on this and had said, this is a real object. We don't know what it is. And it showed a huge diamond-shaped craft over the countryside in Scotland. And because it had background in there, it wasn't just clear sky behind it. You could see the ground, some forested area. Of course, the experts could get to work on it and triangulate and begin to make some calculations about sort of depth of field, distance from the camera, size of the object, height above ground, etc. So that gave us something to work with, and it was on my office wall for years, and the defense intelligence staff had copies too. Then one day, I came into work and it was missing, and I said, "Hey, what's happened? Where's our photo gone?" Turned out my head of division had taken it off the wall, locked it in his safe along with the top secret code word files, because he had convinced himself that it showed some secret prototype hypersonic US aircraft, and said we shouldn't have it on our office wall. Now, one of the reasons why I can talk about all this, of course, people say, how can you talk about this with a security oath, which binds me for life? But the British government has itself declassified and released around 60,000 pages of documents relating to their UFO program, many of which I wrote. And so when this was going to be released, I thought, great, at last people will see this photograph. And when it got to the date when those particular files were to be released, no trace of them. Sorry, they've gone. There was one poor black and white photocopy of a line drawing, but the original had gone.
Mm-hmm. Now, speaking of those files, the intent with the UK government was, as they closed the program, they were also sharing all of their files related to UFOs. And they shared, like you said, a lot. I mean, a whole lot of files. But then once they were finished, people came out and said, hey, wait a sec, what about this? And what about that? So there have been kind of these releases coming out periodically of some stuff they found, I guess, that did not come out in those original batches. And I guess there's more to come.
That's correct, on all fronts. This was originally envisaged as a program to declassify and release the entire archive, subject to the various redactions, of course, that pertain to defense, national security, intelligence, and certain other matters, same as in the US, of course. So some of the documents come out entirely clean, but others do have the black censor's pen through them, so to speak. And this was originally planned as something which would showcase our commitment to open government and freedom of information, as well as dealing with a subject that had become something of a thorn in the side. The Ministry of Defense was getting more requests, more Freedom of Information Act requests on UFOs than any other subject. So the feeling was that a proactive document dump would defuse a lot of this and stop the process of having to deal with it on a case-by-case basis. We thought it would take 2 to 3 years. It took 11. But, and I say we, although I'd left the UFO program by then, I actually came out of retirement to help the National Archives with this, and indeed filmed a video for them and did a whole bunch of interviews to promote this. But it kind of went a little off track, firstly because it took a lot longer than we thought. It took 11 years. And then the trouble was that just as we'd released what we thought were the last ones in June of 2013, suddenly the Ministry of Defense said, oh, we found some more files, and then some of those got released, and some of them were ping-ponging backwards and forwards between National Archives and the Ministry of Defense, and it didn't do us any favors. I think it wasn't helpful. And now they found some more. Most of these are Freedom of Information Act requests and citing reports that date from after our program was closed in 2009. So don't expect any earth-shaking, smoking gun in them. But again, it's slightly embarrassing. And those files were to have come out by the end of March, but obviously, like a lot of government releases, the coronavirus situation has delayed that.
Now, the more conspiracy-minded kind of feel like, oh, the UK is kind of playing tricks on us. They are, censoring these files before they get out. They're hoping that we wouldn't find out about these files, that they haven't released, this sort of thing. Is there anything tricky going on the back end or that you've seen?
Not really, no. I think it's 9 times out of 10, these things are bureaucracy and not conspiracy. I mean, it's literally somebody finding some files at the back of the cupboard and saying, oh gosh, what about these? I thought we'd released all our UFO files. Now, of course, if there was anything suspicious going on, they would have probably just gone straight through the shredder. So to be fair, the Ministry of Defense put their hand up and said, mea culpa. We blundered, we found some more, here you are. So unless you think it's not just a double bluff, but maybe a triple bluff, I think, yes, it's a little bit embarrassing, but they were being fundamentally honest about it. And there's an interesting tie-in, actually, with the release on April 27th of the statement from the Department of Defense about the Navy videos. What this is, I think, people have said, well, why would the Department of Defense release this? We've seen these videos before. They've been in the public domain. Sure. A lot of this, though, is about, as I see it, government taking ownership of this back. I think one could say that the To the Stars Academy was responsible for this story getting out. The New York Times, ditto. To some extent, the Post and Politico and others too. But what you always want to do in government is you want to be driving the narrative. You don't want to be reacting to this. You want to be taking ownership of it. So what I think has happened, particularly if you look at the text of that statement, and they clearly fire a shot across the bows when they use the word unauthorized in terms of the prior releases. That's absolutely deliberate. But what they're doing now, I think, is putting themselves in the driving seat. And all governments like to do that. You don't want to be behind the curve with this. And I think whether we're talking about the Ministry of Defense UFO files or whether we're talking about the US Navy videos, that's an important strategic point to bear in mind.
Yeah, I think that's a segue moving into my next set of questions around this. And you've kind of answered this question, but just to kind of flesh this out a little more. As you said, these videos have been out. The Nimitz video was leaked in 2007. Nobody knows where that came from. But then the New York Times included 2 out of these 3 videos in their story that broke kind of the existence of the ATIP program in 2017. And then months after that, To the Stars, the group that Lou Elizondo now works with, now that he's left the DoD, and it was started by Tom DeLonge, and a lot of ex-intelligence officials and such. Very impressive group of people. But that they then released the last of the 3 videos. And when they released the video, the question comes up: these releases authorized? And they were able to show straight that Elizondo did apparently go through what seems to be the proper paperwork to get those released. But my question was going to be, if we already got these videos out in 2017, why claim that you're only just now authorizing their release now? But I think you answered that question.
Yes, as I said, part of it is about trying to put yourself back in the driver's seat instead of just reacting to other folks putting the story out there, whether it's private groups or whether it's the media. This is putting yourself back front and center. But I think the other thing is it lays the groundwork for maybe further releases here. And again, we can get into what's coming next with a lot of that. But the text of this will have been drafted and cleared and circulated internally very, very carefully. And so use of the word unauthorized is quite a provocative word. I've seen a lot of back and forward about this. I know that Lou is adamant that he followed the process and that if any missteps were made, they were made at the other end, internally, by the internal clearance folks. And that's not a debate that I'm qualified to enter into. That's an entirely separate question of process. I will say this, however. show me a process within government, and I'll show you someone who manages to fill in the wrong form or fills in the correct form but fills it in the wrong way. Somebody who gets the request and is new to this and doesn't understand that there's maybe another step that they didn't take. So I think sometimes we look at this in a very binary way, in a situation where a lot of it, frankly, is not binary. I see it all the time with all sorts of things. One time, I can't remember where it was, maybe one time, nothing to do with UFOs. I think I was in Kosovo or Iraq or something, and somebody said, oh, no real soldier would say bullets. They would always say rounds. And then the very first thing I heard was some soldier say, anyone got any bullets? So, you talk about these things like, oh, was this form filled in correctly? And if this wasn't, then the whole thing's bogus. Well, no, there's a degree of kind of randomness in the system as to sometimes how these things are filled in, which would surprise people. And part of it is whether the people are new in post or not. You get somebody at the end of a 3-year tour of duty, they probably do it very different to how they would have done it in the first week. So, but this is a debate that's going to play out, and it's going to run and run, I'm sure.
Yeah, it would be nice if the DoD would point out specifically, because they have yet to do this, where Elizondo's forms are, where he went astray, what steps he didn't take, and where those steps are documented. It would be helpful, I think, for the conversation to see, like you said, where maybe those discrepancies are, and they probably likely are something very minute. Like any of us who've gone to the DMV or to go get our passport and bring our pile of paperwork and have been told, oh, you forgot something, or you checked the wrong box. We've all kind of gone through this experience with the government. Yes.
And, I think, as I say, this is a debate that's going to run and run. One thing I will say, though, is that obviously and this goes back to the point about wanting to take the strategic ownership of this, the subject to all the usual legal processes of Freedom of Information Act and obviously journalists and broadcasters having legitimate inquiries. But there comes a point where the DoD is not going to jump through every hoop that the UFO community wants it to jump through. And they're not going to come back on every point and say, well, what about this or what about that? There comes a point where, particularly in the current environment with everyone reconfigured on coronavirus, they're simply going to fall back on, we're not going to discuss that, or we have nothing further to add to our statements. It's frustrating. It's not helpful, but arguably these people are not there to be helpful to the UFO community. They are there to defend the realm.
On that topic, there have been some developments, and I did want to get further insight into kind of the difference in the approach that these different groups have been taking in response to the discovery of the existence of ATIP and these Navy cases. And for instance, soon after this all came out, the Navy has been very forthcoming. They've said, yes, those incidents occurred. We do consider them unidentified. We take these, we and the Air Force take these very seriously. The Air Force then followed up with crickets. Nothing. We've heard really practically nothing, except for recently we did discover that they also did an investigation. They confirmed that ATIP did investigate UFOs. They also wanted to make sure that the videos were not shared inappropriately. And they said, no, that to their belief that there was nothing classified that was released that shouldn't have been released. However, the Department of Defense has been very combative. They have sort of challenged a lot of the claims from Elizondo and To the Stars that were in that New York Times story. And we got a little bit of insight from Tyler Rogaway of The Drive. He's a defense writer. And he wrote an article how this topic, he's never ran into this sort of resistance with the DoD press offices ever. They deal with them on a daily basis because this is their topic. This is what they cover. And he kind of chronicled the difficulty he's had and this internal struggle where the DoD is taken over from the Air Force and the Navy, commenting on this topic in particular. Do you find that unusual, maybe because you were in that kind of role of getting out information to the press on this topic. What is your insight on what might be going on there?
It is unusual, and I'll tell an anecdote about something that happened at the Ministry of Defense before I try to maybe contextualize some of this. One time, we were doing something at the MOD. I think it related to publication of an article about UFOs or declassification of some file or something. And I remember somebody throwing up their hands in horror at the end of all this and saying, "My goodness, Nick, there's more fuss about this UFO topic than there is about these darn books that all the special forces soldiers keep writing, to the huge embarrassment of and annoyance of a lot of people in the Ministry of Defense." It's almost as if there's something about this subject which is more sensitive than even the Special Air Service and all those branches of the military. So that's my little anecdote about how it reads across to the UK. But let me now try and contextualize some of this. As you know, there has been what I will perhaps charitably call some flip-flopping on this issue of the precise role of ATIP, and specifically the question of whether ATIP did or did not investigate UFOs. Now, when the program first was revealed, it was very clear from the DIA and the DoD that the line that they were pushing with the media and the public was this was a program looking at next generation aerospace threats. There's a fine line between the word aerospace and aviation, and of course that was a great debate in the early days, and it is important, but these sorts of details matter, and there is context to that. But that's where we were, and then there was a little bit of extra put onto one of the statements, and it was a phrase along the lines, I don't have it in front of me, but ATIP looked at next generation aerospace programs, including reports from credible sources, which would include US Navy pilots, where there was a suggestion of unique phenomenology. That was the phrase that was used. Then that seemed to be walked back. Then Stephen Greenstreet at the Post got that great admission from the Navy, where they said, we do indeed investigate unidentified aerial phenomena. And I was pleased to see that they went on to say, and yes, we got that phrase, UAP, from the British government, which of course came from us in the Ministry of Defense in the 90s, when we deliberately dropped UFO and replaced it with UAP, at least in our internal policy discussions, not with the public or the media, but internally. And the US government has now adopted that. But then the DoD stepped in and said, look, we don't particularly want Navy and Air Force responding separately to media inquiries on this, even to Freedom of Information Act requests. We'd better take a centralized grip on this. And then they walked back, of course, that scoop that Stephen Greenstreet got, and the current statement, DoD statement, is neither ATIP nor ORSAP were UAP related, ORSAP being essentially the ATIP contract, though there's some debate about that. Now, so I think that's about 4 or 5 different versions of whether ATIP did or didn't investigate UFOs. But as I think you know, the DoD is currently working on a new statement about the role of ATIP. And we've been promised this statement for some weeks, if not months now. And, it might come out today, it might be later this week, it might be next week, it might be delayed again. I don't know. But I can, if it helps, I can say a little bit about why that new statement is coming out. And it's 2 things. Firstly, Tim McMillan did a great article in Popular Mechanics, where he essentially brought out a lot of evidence showing that despite this, neither ATIP nor ORSAP were UAP related. Absolutely. And he presented some of this evidence. It was. They absolutely were looking at that. So part of why the statement is being recast has to do with Tim's Popular Mechanics article. And the other half, and I can speak about this with much more authority, of course, is because I asked a specific question. When the DoD said, this is just about next generation aviation or aerospace threats, and DIA told Congress the same thing, of course, what they'd forgotten, or what they maybe hoped that the media had forgotten, was that around a year ago, the DIA's letter to Congress about ATIP was released. And as the attachment to that letter, there was the list of 38 studies, technical reports that had been produced under the ATIP contract. And one of them was about the Drake equation. Now, I had made a specific point about this one, and I made it on one of my many interviews on Tucker Carlson Tonight, and I made it to the DoD. I said, look, if this is about next generation aviation threats to the US, why are you looking at the Drake equation? The only purpose of the Drake equation is to estimate the number of communicable civilizations in the Milky Way. So it kind of, there's a fundamental disconnect there. A lot of the other 38 papers, even the really far out ones on anti-gravity, wormholes, warp drive, you could say, well, we don't know what aviation advances there might be in the next 50 years. You could always make the argument, well, maybe the Russians or the Chinese will find something. But with the Drake equation, it's nothing to do with Russia and China. So I said to the DoD, how is this compatible? How is the not UAP related line compatible with studying the Drake equation? And they said, we'll get back to you on that. And that's where we are.
Yeah, and another aspect to this, now this is what you're talking about, is kind of the official document debate. However, really in the New York Times mind, they solved this problem and they vetted all of this because they had testimony from firsthand witnesses, such as Harry Reid, who really was the founder of the program, who said this was absolutely about UFOs. Elizondo, who ran the program, who said this is absolutely about UFOs. Some of the contractors, like Dr. Halpedoff, for example, that were part of ATIP work, and some of these documents that you referred to, at least one of them, he wrote one of the papers. He said this was absolutely about UFOs. So all of the firsthand people had already confirmed this is about UFOs, yet the DoD is still fighting that, whereas the people who would know best, the people who ran and created the program, have already confirmed this. It's very, it just seems as though the DoD is not very happy about the release of this information.
Yes, look, I'm not for a moment suggesting the DoD is lying about this. I think the fundamental problem is that what's happening now is that their public affairs spokespeople are scrambling around trying to find what the heck went on in a program that was clearly deeply compartmentalized and largely kept off the radar by being put into the private sector via a defense contract. And it's not that they're lying about this. It's that I think they genuinely can't figure it out. They can't get access to much of the paperwork. They can't necessarily get access to all of the people that were involved. And look, here's another thing. When we in the Ministry of Defense in the 1990s wanted to get funding for a study, a proper intelligence assessment of the UFO phenomenon, which was codenamed Project Condign, the reason we did that is we, as I mentioned earlier in our conversation today, we dropped the term UFO entirely and we replaced it with UAP. So we were able to say, look, we're not this isn't a UFO study. we're looking at unidentified aerial phenomena. We don't know what this is. It might be Russia, might be China, might be some sort of exotic atmospheric plasma phenomena. So it was put out there as a science problem and as a defense problem. I suspect that ATIP did a similar thing. To get the funding for this in the first place, they had to kind of slightly, wordsmith it and say, look, no, this has nothing to do with little green men. This is about next generation aerospace threats to the United States. Only thing is, they didn't say from who. They used the word foreign. Well, look, if there's a paper on the Drake equation in your study, how foreign is foreign? And by the way, one very other important point, people say, what's in those 38 technical reports? Anti-gravity, invisibility, wormholes, warp drive, stargates, the Drake equation. What's equally important is what isn't in those 38 papers. There are none of those papers relate to Russia or China in terms of factory capacity, aeronautical engineering ability. How are they getting on stealth? What are North Korea doing? What is Iran doing? Hypersonic missiles, drone swarms. None of that. It's not about that at all. So this is why I say this really isn't about Russia and China at all. But as I say, I'm not accusing the Department of Defense about lying here. I'm saying they're genuinely struggling themselves to dig out what the heck was done and how this program or maybe programs were kind of put into the system in the first place against, I'm sure, objections from people who would never have authorized the study of UFOs. And that's the point. How do you get it past the gatekeepers who would never have funded a UFO study? Well, you dress it up as something else.
Gotcha. Do you have time to answer a couple questions from the chat before we get into talking about your current project?
Sure.
Okay, great. There is one person who's been commenting quite a bit. They want to know about the possibility of, I guess, some UAPs being water creatures or underwater creatures. And I'm guessing they specifically mean when objects are seen under the water.
Well, it's an interesting, I suppose, evolution of the theory that some UFOs are I think the phrase from Trevor James Constable and others was sky critters. And I'm going back to the 50s and the 60s there. But of course, it's a great staple of sci-fi that perhaps interstellar travel is achieved not by biological entities building spacecraft, but by those entities themselves. It's an interesting thought. I don't really have an evaluation on it. Obviously, you look at those Navy videos and you could say, well, there are a number of possibilities. Is it our own tech? Is it Russia? Is it China? Is it extraterrestrial? And yeah, absolutely. Add something like that into the mix. There will be, I've commented on this before, even if the official position of the Department of Defense is we don't know, these things are unidentified, there will be in the system, and the president will have gotten this, and the various senators who've been briefed will have gotten this. There will be a best current assessment in the system. Whether water creatures made it into that assessment or not, I don't know. If it did, I suspect as a minority report. But interesting if true.
Right, and that assessment is something that hopefully we'll see in the future. That's something that people are definitely trying to get. Yeah,
you won't see it. I mean, that absolutely. When I first asked the DoD about this, firstly they dodged the question, and then when I said, "Come on, I'm talking about the best current assessment that every briefer will have to have when they go in to brief POTUS or Armed Forces Committee, Intelligence Committee," and as I say, first they dodged the question, and then they refused to answer it and said, "We won't be commenting on that."
Another question is, do you believe that there are any ongoing UFO projects like ATIP or yours in the US or the UK?
Yes, completely. How could there not be? These sightings haven't stopped. Not just Lou Elizondo, but the Navy themselves have described this and indeed justified the issuing of guidance to their pilots and other personnel about what to do if they encounter these things. They've justified that on the basis of the phrase ongoing series of incursions into restricted military airspace. None of this stopped mysteriously in 2004, 2015. It's happening now. And so you can't, with this situation, particularly when you have some very good, credible evidence and the tools in which to do the analysis, and I'm talking about things like MASINT, measurement and signature intelligence. When you have those resources and capabilities, you're not going to ignore these pilots. So absolutely, there will be programs. But again, I can tell you from my own experience, they will have changed title. They will have probably moved to a different agency, maybe largely, again, back into the private sector. But this sort of thing, you don't ignore it. You can't.
Right. Lou Elizondo himself has said that ATIP did continue. He believes the names changed, and it possibly could have moved from where he was, the Office of the Secretary of Defense, OSD, to another department, like you mentioned, all to keep this under the radar. And I guess some of those responsibilities could also be taken up by other agencies, such as perhaps other foreign technology, intelligence sort of agencies, right?
Yes, and of course, you've only got to look at that marvelous Space Force recruitment ad that they put out a few days ago to sort of say, well, maybe they've got a role too. Who knows? I mean, that's you watching that, and it's marvelous, by the way. It's the sort of thing I never thought I would see outside of an environment like Star Trek, and now it's like our kind of childhood SF fantasies are all coming true. So yeah, who knows where it is? But maybe it's like a hot potato that nobody wants, or maybe if there are resources in it, people do want it. But it's probably the last place you expect it to be. I remember when the UFO community was playing that guessing game in the 80s and the 90s and saying, well, who has the lead for this now? Is it CIA? Is it NASA? DIA, Defense Intelligence Agency, wasn't really put up as this. And while you occasionally heard people talk about the Navy, that was very much a sort of minority report theory. And now we know differently.
Another question is, they're talking about RAF correspondence, that was not the Royal Air Force, for people who aren't familiar with that term, wasn't covered in the MOD releases. So in other words, that correspondence regarding UFOs wasn't in those releases. And they're wondering, how could we go about digging for more? So was that correspondence not included? And how would people get it?
Well, the Ministry of Defense terminated their UFO program at the end of December 2009. But of course, the sightings didn't stop. People kept on making reports. And of course, journalists kept asking questions. UFO researchers and others submitted Freedom of Information Act requests. So there's a whole bunch of post-2009 material and some pre-2009 material that just got overlooked. The intention, most of what's been released already has gone on to the National Archives website. And because of coronavirus, they now have waived the small fee for this. So you can read a lot of the files that I wrote on this. But the new material, the material that they missed, this will be put up separately, not on the National Archives website in the UK, but on the gov.uk website. Now, they were hoping to put that material up by the end of the first quarter. So, in other words, by the end of March this year. Obviously, coronavirus and the Ministry of Defense response to it and the wider government response has delayed that. But hopefully it will go up sooner rather than later. But yes, watch gov.uk for that. But like I say, don't expect it to be too exciting. Not as good as the material that we've already put out there.
Right. Another question. Something that was addressed this morning, kind of on the last question we had talked about, Chris Mellon, who's a part of To the Stars, and he was an assistant deputy director of intelligence for a period of time. So very high level briefing, doing briefings at the Capitol Hill and all of that. He said, as far as programs go, I think his point being that although, and I'd love to hear you speak to this because I think you actually have a similar point that you commonly make. Although there may be other programs looking at this phenomena, it doesn't mean that, there's the Roswell UFO and then there's an alien under Area 51 or something like that. But at least all appearances seem to be that the government really doesn't have a lot more knowledge than we do about this topic.
And sometimes I know that Chris Mellon did a Twitter Ask Me Anything this morning. I haven't read it all, but I did see one great phrase where he said, Uncle Sam has a pretty big basement, and we need to rummage around in there. And it's a serious point, actually. Sometimes even people in the system don't know what's in the system. Firstly, obviously, self-evidently, because many of these programs are highly classified and deeply compartmentalized. But secondly, until comparatively recently, and even now, we don't tend to have as good a corporate memory as we should. Computers are part of that, and obviously the pre-computer age. But I mean, I literally, earlier in our conversation, I used the phrase, found some files at the back of a cupboard. I mean, that sometimes literally is the territory that we're in. And of course, people outside the system say, oh, that would never happen. You could never have a highly sensitive program and just find an old file in the basement somewhere. Absolutely, you could. Happens all the time on a whole range of subjects. So sometimes we don't even know what we had. When ATIP was first revealed, I made in one of my media interviews about this, and I was interviewed not because I have anything to do with ATIP. I should hasten to add, I have had zero involvement with the ATIP program. I was simply being interviewed to help contextualize it by virtue of having run a UFO program for the British government. But when this story first came out, I made a comment. I said, they've found a UFO program, but maybe they haven't found the UFO program. And particularly in these days of inter-service rivalry and turf wars, I wouldn't put it past, particularly my knowledge of the US government, there being multiple programs across multiple agencies, and maybe the private sector too. And this is a recipe for confusion. And I should just address one point, because I've been criticized on this in the last couple of days. I mean, I mentioned the DoD trying to coordinate a lot of this and struggling themselves to find out what was done in their name. And I think that's a lot of where we're at by now. Same with the Freedom of Information Act responses. I think they've said, I've seen a few statements to say, are they trying to fix the system here and cheat it? I don't think they are. What I've seen from some of the documents is simply DoD reaching out, for example, and saying, look, it would be kind of crazy if Navy looks at this and says, we can release this sort of thing, and Air Force says, no, we should hold it back. Let's ensure we're consistent. But I think whether it's been stated or not, it's hardwired into these people. And I've handled these sorts of things before. I've drafted statements for the press office. I've handled Freedom of Information Act requests from within government. Always, it's hardwired into us. Yes, you coordinate across government. You ensure consistency of response, but you absolutely do not break the law. Mm-hmm. I mean, that's, it's just beyond the pale.
Mm-hmm. And someone had
there may be things which the public and the media might regard as, I don't know, sharp practice, but the law is the law. And any of us who have been involved in this, we take this extremely seriously. Firstly, on a point of honor, duty, and country, whatever you call it. But secondly, we do it because it's the law.
Someone had mentioned along those lines that you probably cannot share all of your knowledge from your time at the Ministry of Defense. suggesting that hopefully someday you can. But you've kind of addressed that, even if it is the case that you can at some point, there's not necessarily going to be anything that startling.
Look, I'm in the fortunate position of the fact that I can speak out on this largely because the British government, my old employers, have themselves released a lot of these files, and obviously sometimes even my name's redacted, but largely not. And you can go onto the British Parliament website and find out what I did between 1991 and 1994. It's there on the website of the British Parliament. You know, Mr. Nick Pope investigated UFOs to determine if there was a threat to the defense of the United Kingdom. My secrecy oath, yes, I took early retirement in 2006. My secrecy oath binds me for life. But when my own employer declassifies and releases the files that I worked on and wrote, obviously that gives me some leeway. Yes, there's a line, and like Lou and others, and like Lou and Chris Mellon, sometimes it's a difficult line to follow, but we all know where it is, and we're all super careful about not crossing it. At the point at which our respective governments maybe say a little more, I'm sure we'll all be able to say a little more, and bring it on. I'm all for declassifying and releasing information where it can be done without compromising national security, and not necessarily on this issue, but sometimes you declassify something here and it has an unintended consequence somewhere else. So you do need to be very careful, but where we can get it out, absolutely. Let's get it out there, and let's do what I think we're beginning to do now, have a serious grown-up conversation about this for the first time, in terms of defense and national security, without the whole thing just becoming, I suppose, laughed at or ridiculed. And we are now having that conversation with pilots, with radar operators, with former intelligence personnel, with the military, with political figures, and the mainstream media is engaging on that. And great, long overdue.
That's a perfect segue into what I was going to talk about. By the way, Alan, you figured out the logo from my hat. You can see it there. Good job. But along those lines, maybe we don't have this confession of aliens in cahoots in some secret lab or something like that. But what has happened is extremely significant, in that now we have the Navy saying they've looked into unidentified objects, the Pentagon, all of these organizations now even saying they take things seriously. And like you said, the mainstream media getting involved and being able to have conversations. And that brings me to kind of a cool project that you're working on with the New York Post and Stephen Greenstreet, who you mentioned earlier. You're even doing with the mainstream media outlet a regular show. I think it's similar to this one on UFOs. Maybe you can explain that.
Sure. Well, the Basement Office is now in its second season, and the second episode of the second season just went live this morning, and it's a great show. Stephen Greenstreet comes to this as both a journalist and as a filmmaker. And of course, I mean, when I say as a journalist, I mentioned earlier his scoop about getting that critical Navy admission about, yes, we do look at UAPs and we still consider these things unidentified. So Stephen did this show, and he asked me to come on board with it, the Basement Office, and we really, I guess, taking the revelations about the ATIP program and the US Navy videos as really the start point for this. We take a deep dive into that story, but also into specific stories from the history of the UFO phenomenon, whether it's the Rendlesham Forest incident, whether it's pilot sightings. This morning's episode, which ties in nicely with that question that we had earlier, by the way, is about USOs, unidentified submerged objects, and the whole interrelationship between UFOs and water, which has been something that, although it's been brought to the fore by these Navy sightings. It's been something that's been there for decades. So the basement office is available completely free on the New York Post's website, on their YouTube channel. It's also cross-posted, I think, on their virtual, on the various social media feeds. But yeah, and Stephen, when I went to New York to film this, Stephen had done such an incredible deep dive into this subject. He comes out with literally folders and folders of material, and his deep knowledge for this kind of shines through this project. And you'll say something and he'll say, but wait a minute, what about that case from 1959 where it was reported that those 3 witnesses, and I've got the file here, and I'll be like, wow, I'd forgotten about that case even existed. And he's not only read into it, but he's printed it off, and he's got questions on it. So this is a great example of how I think this content, this subject, has gone from fringe to mainstream. And for those that haven't seen the basement office, I mean, shameless plug, it is a very thorough examination of some of these stories, but we have great fun with it too. And if Stephen will forgive me for saying so, his facial expressions and reactions to some of this are priceless and are pretty much becoming, I think, memes in their own right. But yes, we have fun with the show, but it's absolutely dead serious. And what people have said about it is that it bridges the gap in that you can be a newcomer to this subject and you can like it, but the people with already a deep knowledge of this topic don't feel that this is just sort of a primer, sort of beginner's lesson 101. There's something for the deep specialists too. So everyone can enjoy the basement office, and I would urge them to do so. And we've got some great, we've got some great scoops coming up. I'm not sure if this is going to be a 5 or 6 episode season, but we've got some great scoops coming up. I'm not going to drop any spoilers here, but yeah, watch the New York Post's website and their YouTube channel for the basement office. More to come.
A lot of fans of the show, it seems, in the chat. I think Stephen Greenstreet was in the chat a moment ago also, so you might have heard your comment there. But,
right. Hello, Stephen.
But like Stephen, it seems like all of this recent news has emboldened some of these UFO fans who are in the mainstream media, who are kind of in the closet about it, to kind of come out of the closet and tip their toe into actually covering this topic, which has also been pretty cool.
Well, we've had people like Brian Bender from Politico. We've had Tyler and Brett from Warzone and The Drive, and a number of others who've got absolutely staggeringly impressive credentials and background into understanding some of this against the concept, against the background of government programs, aviation, deep black projects. And for these people now to be coming at this subject and saying, okay, now I can run a UFO story without my editor rolling his or her eyes and saying, not on my watch. And now these people are being told, yeah, wait, I get that there's a story here. I mean, look, 2.5 years ago, the official position of the US government was no one's interested in this, and we don't have a program. It's been staggering to me how little comeback, how little fallout there has been. And I don't know whether those statements can still be gotten out on the Wayback Machine, or whether they've just been quietly scrubbed out of the historical record like some sort of Orwellian unperson. But as I say, we've come a long way, and some of the journalists and some of the new people coming in, like Tim McMillan, like Mick West, whether you agree with these people or not, they're looking at this, and I would use the phrase, and I'm including you in this as well, of course. What we're seeing now is through these new ways of access, and we're seeing the rise of citizen journalism and people who've been at this, like yourself, for decades and have that deep specialist knowledge, saying if the mainstream media isn't going to do their job, we'll do it for them. And then you are actually now becoming the new mainstream. And then that itself, there's like a feedback loop. It then encourages the people in the old traditional mainstream to say, hey, wait a minute, we're going to be irrelevant if we don't get on this. And that's no disrespect to people like Ralph Blumenthal and Helene Cooper and Leslie Kean, of course, who were in this arguably from the beginning of this renaissance of the subject. But now more and more people are coming into this, some from traditional journalistic backgrounds, others less so, but they're getting into these new outlets, whether it's Den of Geek, whether it's UFO articles getting into popular mechanics, whether it's Warzone and the Drive getting into this. And, I'm sure from time to time there's creative tension between a lot of these people, and certainly differences of opinion. My goodness, yes, absolutely. But you could pick any subject, whether it's politics, religion, economics, and you'd find exactly the same. There's no doubt that we are in a much more healthy situation with this subject than we were a couple of years ago. As I say, out of the fringe into the mainstream. We've lost all this rolling of eyes and laughing, and we're now having a serious discussion. And phrases like imint and mazint are being bandied around in UFO stories as if it's now part of the new conversation, which it is, and rightly so.
Yeah, I am greatly enjoying the mainstream media contributions, especially from the people that you mentioned. And I should note that Kane and Blumenthal and Cooper were the ones who wrote that New York Times article that kind of broke all this open, that article in December 2017 about ATIP. But
yes, and my apologies to anyone I forgot to mention, any critical article or journalist, whether they're mainstream or new citizen journalist. I mean, you can't name check everyone. You
right.
Try, I guess, and there's always going to be someone afterwards who says, hey, but what about my work? And I'm sorry to whoever that was.
Well, thank you so much for joining us, Nick. This has been incredibly enlightening. You have a very unique perspective, having worked in the government looking at UFOs, and so this has been very insightful, as every one of our conversations are. So thank you so much for joining.
Thank you. And I'm sorry if we didn't get to all of the questions. I'm sure either I'll come back here or I'll do maybe an AMA on Twitter like Chris Mellon, and I'll try and be a little bit more accountable now all this is coming out. Well,
actually, to that point, some people were asking to have a Discord set up because some of the people in the chat want to continue talking about this topic. And so you can see below me here, Den of Geek did set up a Discord. So if you want to continue the discussion online, you can go there and keep discussing it. Otherwise, continue to watch our coverage here at Den of Geek. We do have more coming up, and we also have more of these live stream videos coming up. So stay tuned to the Den of Geek social media for more information on that. And of course, you can see some of the links to Nick's work as well, and go check out his New York Post Basement Conversations videos with Stephen Greenstreet. So thank you again, Nick. Thanks so much for joining us.
Thank you.
And thank you all the audience for joining us as well and for your great questions. And we will see you next time.